Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody, from whatever part of the world you're listening to our podcasts. My name is Al Mina. I'm the concept author of Face Economics, the utilization of the social media platform in economic development worldwide. My background is in economic development, capacity building, institutional development in emerging and frontier markets of Central and Eastern Europe. Thank you for joining me. I'm back, and again, I've been doing my research on the situation in Ukraine, and time again, I keep coming up with a lot of loose ends and question marks regarding this issue. It's kind of a very strange situation because they've gotten billions and billions of U.S. aid from American taxpayers, and yet things aren't so clear. I'm not referring to, the current situation in the war, but the overall decision-making process in providing assistance to the Ukrainian government, and how did we amass such a large sum of money being sent to a country that has nothing to do directly with the U.S. We're not, they're not a territory, they're not a state, and yet they've received billions and billions of U.S. taxes from us. Yes, some of those taxes did go to, American companies that are service providers and product providers, because some of those services and products aren't available in Ukraine and other parts of Europe. So naturally, in order for them to acquire those resources, we have to produce those products, and those products have to be paid for. But it's not all about us pocketing those funds and benefiting our society with those funds. It's actually the complete opposite, because if we don't produce those goods and services, then the likelihood of Ukraine having a halfway chance of succeeding is at a very minimal. With that being said, folks, my name is Al Mina again. I'm the concept author of Face Economics, the utilization of the social media platform in economic development worldwide. Thank you for joining me, and I am truly honored for you to consider listening to some of my thoughts and ideas regarding the current economic crisis as well as conflict in Ukraine. One thing in particular also that caught my attention upon reviewing some of the conditions and the pre-existing conditions in Ukraine is this Hispanic American prisoner of war not getting any form of assistance from the U.S. government, which is very concerning in my opinion, because we managed to convince Russia to basically release their American prisoner, Miss Brittney Griner. She's a basketball player who was jailed in Russia for drug conviction. And Russia is not exactly our major partner or ally, and yet we managed to convince them and work with them to have them release an American prisoner that had brought in drugs into their country, but yet we can't help Mr. Gonzalo Lira, a Hispanic American prisoner of war in Ukraine, be released from prison, even though we're funding, American taxpayers are funding Ukraine billions worth. So if we're funding them and we trust them with our money, why can't they trust us to do the right thing and let us Americans decide if Mr. Gonzalo Lira had overstepped his boundaries? Because all he really did was review and basically, reflect on things that are happening in Ukraine. He's basically a subject matter expert on the ground compared to some of our politicians and decision makers that have released and provided Ukraine with billions and billions of dollars worth of U.S. funds. Gonzalo Lira has experience on the ground. He's got subject matter expertise regarding the society in Ukraine, the government, the norms, traditions, language, mindset, worldview of the population. I mean, in all reality, Ukraine was never, a complete best friend of the U.S. to begin with. If you look at, the history between the two countries, Ukraine and the U.S. were never that close. Nowhere near when Ukraine and Russia were trading partners, best friends, and family, familiar connections with their families from both countries. They share the same religion, there's a lot of Ukrainians that speaks Russian and vice versa, Russians that speaks Ukrainian. People have intermarriage among themselves between Russia and Ukraine. So I still don't get why the U.S. government hasn't managed to, provide assistance to an American citizen, a Hispanic American prisoner of war in Ukraine. I don't understand whatsoever what the hesitation is. Okay, his only, I wouldn't even fault him for this, for speaking his mind, for sharing what he believes in on his YouTube channel. When is that a violation of anyone's rights? He didn't shoot anyone. He didn't, attack anybody physically. He was just reflecting on some of the things that he saw and noticed within the government, which, if Ukraine truly wants to be a democratic society, then they need to learn what dissent is. With that being said, folks, my name again is Al Mina. Thank you for listening to my podcast on Spotify and video blog on our YouTube Face Economics TV channel. If by any chance we get cut off on our video blog, I will share the link at the bottom of this video blog on our Face Economics TV YouTube channel, so you can continue to listen to this podcast on our Spotify platform, which is going to be provided. The link's going to be provided at the bottom. So yes, folks, there's a lot of question marks that's happening that I'm not so sure why no one in Congress, Senate, or even the White House have asked these questions and kind of test things out first before releasing so much funds to Ukraine. I don't get it. Yes, I understand that there's a conflict there, and yes, I understand that they're lacking, resources. But before the war, we've actually consulted with the Ukrainian government and, try to introduce to them ways to basically de-escalate the situation. And Mr. Zelensky basically rejected it, that wisdom and assistance from our government. So Yeah, folks, there's just so many question marks, and I apologize for bringing up a lot of these questions, but many of you, especially the regular Americans, simply don't have enough experience or um, background knowledge on emerging and frontier markets of Central and Eastern Europe. So I'm going to be asking these questions on your behalf, and feel free to let me know if there are anything else that you want me to ask, on our podcast regarding the current situation in Ukraine, the conflict that's been ongoing almost, 2 years, nearly 2 years. Just very crazy situation going on there. And there's a lot of loose ends and a lot of question marks that I don't know if any of our decision makers in the U.S. government have asked or knows about, but consider or elected not to share those answers with us. So thank you so much for listening. My name is Al Mina. By the way, if you are interested in learning about how the Ukrainian government is going to be able to repay us American taxpayers, regardless if you're a citizen or an immigrant, but if you're paying tax, you can request, correspondence from the Ukrainian government to provide, a repayment structure that they've created or have been working on or have considered for them to repay the amount that have been relinquished to them, that have been given to them by the U.S. government. So all you have to be is a U.S. citizen, taxpayer, or a legal immigrant that pays tax, and you may request, information on repayment structure, on how the Ukrainian government will be repaying all the U.S. taxes, accounts receivable for us Americans. These are accounts receivable in accounting that they have to pay for as a liability to us. So you can ask the Ukrainian government via direct, letter to their embassy or to whoever makes the decision regarding their accounts receivable, department within their government. That said, folks, there's just way too many things that are just coming up, and as this war persists, there's a lot of question marks. There's a lot of very ambiguous situations and correspondence that are shared with the public in America, because most Americans simply don't have enough experience in emerging and frontier markets of Central and Eastern Europe. So all they're going by is what they see on the news or read on the news. And most of the time, those people covering the news have an agenda. They want more eyeballs. They want, a way to profit from the news. And so there are certain stories that they're preventing American taxpayers to know about, and even the world community to know about, because I believe if they truly wanted to, get this whole situation, in the books, basically, to finish it off and just, close this episode of this, very tragic human suffering in both countries, in Ukraine and Russia, then they would have basically inform the public of what's truly happening in Ukraine. But if they don't have a lot of experience in Eastern and Central Europe, then they probably don't have much of a reference on where to even start or how to share accurate, relevant information. And that goes, for our elected officials as well. Most of them probably doesn't have any way of educating themselves with adequate information, other than what's being provided to them by maybe the embassy from Ukraine, the U.S. Embassy in Kiev, or whoever is, providing their overall decision-making guidance in order to influence them. That's all they have. They don't really, they haven't work or live in Central and Eastern Europe to have, a first-hand knowledge of what's really happening or how to deal with people from the region. Okay. The election season is fairly close, and I believe it's extremely important for the American public to know which elected official signed off on those billions and billions of dollars worth of aid without real experience, local knowledge, or regional background, either working or living in the region, to assess the condition of the local market and population, their overall ties with each other. And I believe it's important that we know who those elected officials are as American taxpayers, because that's an executive level decision. When you appropriate money for that amount, that's an executive level decision, meaning they have to review all pertinent information that are extremely, extremely detailed and specific. Okay, so if the material is not detailed and specific, and the people that created those material are not reliable, they don't have subject matter expertise, or simply aren't trained to deliver decision-making material, okay, to decision makers, and these decision makers have been led to believe otherwise, they've been, basically misinformed, then that's completely, unacceptable, especially with the amount of money that we appropriated to Ukraine. Okay, look, another issue is this NATO situation. Most countries that joins NATO are countries that either can't protect themselves independently by themselves, or they don't want to protect themselves independently without the strength of a group of nations. Now, at the onset of this war, Ukraine basically told the world that they're preserving democracy. They're making sure that nobody else gets attacked by the Russians, which there isn't anything in my research or anywhere that indicated that Russia would like to attack any other countries, especially not NATO member countries. So what precipitated that narrative from the Ukrainians? They're the one that wants to join NATO. They wanted to join the European Union. So why are they saying that without them, they're fighting for the rest of the world? If that were to be the case, why would you engage in a war that you can't win without the rest of the world? The rest of the world, and even the notion of the rest of the world being attacked by Russia is so far. It's so far-fetched that there is no indicator, not one, country is being violated by the Russians. I just don't get it. I mean, it's just mind-boggling to me, that they would use that narrative that they're preserving democracy and fighting for the rest of the world on our behalf. But most of the countries that have had issues with Russia um, aren't feeling particularly, you know, um, threatened with this war between Russia and Ukraine. They don't even see Russia being interested in going to war with those countries that Russia had fought with before, because they know what the whole reason is behind the conflict, between Russia and Ukraine. So it's just pretty strange. And another issue is that U.S. born or non-U.S. born, Ukrainian citizens are the diaspora aren't calling for the release of Gonzalo Lira, an American citizen. I find that extremely strange, where the diaspora, U.S. born Ukrainians and immigrant Ukrainians in the U.S., okay, are not, lobbying. They're not out there in front of the White House making sure that the Biden administration and the State Department and the Department of Defense would find a way to have a prisoner of war, a POW in Ukraine, be released and be sent back to their families, to his family. I find that really strange. And how come we haven't considered, looking into the finances, the bank accounts of those Ukrainian government officials, the representatives, the people that are endorsing, their narrative throughout the world? Why aren't we checking into their bank accounts and see who's profiting from all this? I mean, we already know that the Russians are pretty much, going bankrupt because they're not profiting from this war. Okay, so something is just not driving. It's not making a whole lot of sense. And, I don't blame the majority of the American public for not knowing, because very few of them have experience and background knowledge in this part in Eastern and Central Europe. So all they're going by is what the news stations are feeding them. Luckily now, because of social media, there are ways to bypass, profiting news channels from this war. There are, other news sources outside of the U.S. that can provide information in English that is more fair and balanced and aren't profiting from, this war. But unfortunately, majority of Americans, since they don't know the difference, they don't have, any background knowledge, it's very tough for them to make a decision whether to support Ukraine or not support Russia, because it's a one-sided argument most of the time. I've yet to come across any Russian news in English in the U.S. or western part of Europe that is not, dogging them out and not turning them into a monster. I mean, I'm not trying to take sides here. I'm just trying to have, as a decision maker, I just want to make sure that I have a, accurate, material to review and, relevant information to digest. That's all I'm asking. I'm not here to, attack each or any one country, not, Ukraine or Russia. I just simply want to make sure that I'm getting relevant information that are accurate, that isn't spun and, muddied up by special interests, Right. So anyway, yeah, definitely want to hear your thoughts, suggestions, any, concerns that y'all might have, things that you would like for me to look into and review. So again, my background is in emerging and frontier markets of Central and Eastern Europe. I was a former Peace Corps volunteer in the region, and so I've been commuting between the U.S. and Central and Eastern Europe for quite some time now to understand, the dynamics of the markets and the overall government policy in, trying to bring in economic growth, investment, and, develop trade and commercial relationship with various countries in Central and Eastern Europe with the U.S. So that's my background. And the reason I decided to get involved, or not really involved, but kind of, reflect on what's going on in the region is because there's a lot of disjointed, inaccurate material that was shared with the American public regarding this war and, why we should support and fund Ukraine with billions and billions of dollars in the next couple of years, or not actually, several more years, I believe is the overall game plan, is to fund them for several more years worth billions of dollars. So yeah, I think it's not fair for a lot of our citizens, especially, single earner families, people that are on, food stamps, people that are making minimum wage, people that, are struggling to pay their mortgage, their rent, people that are basically going to be in debt for the rest of their lives for educating themselves, people with student loans, for wanting to educate themselves. We put that kind of pressure on people just, getting out of college and starting off with life with a massive burden. And yet we as a government, would send billions and billions to a country that wanted to fight, that wanted to engage in a war. And they know perfectly well that they are not able to engage in a war, situation. But yet they went ahead and engaged instead of de-escalating the situation, be engaged in diplomacy, try to, wrangle up countries to work things out with the Russians. Again, folks, I'm just looking out for a lot of American taxpayers that are going through adverse economic hardship. I know what it's like. I know what, it entails when you request help from your government and your government doesn't want to help you because their agenda doesn't fit your overall situation. I know what that's like, and I really feel for tons of Americans that are having to bust their butt day in, day out, commute hours back and forth to go to work and just make enough to cover their rent or mortgage and utilities and food. So I feel for them. The world have been thinking for many years, for decades upon decades, that we've got it good in America, that everybody's, well off, which is the farthest from the truth. Maybe the politicians, the millionaire politicians that are also making hundreds of thousands for working in Congress and Senate and the White House, they make hundreds of thousands, so, and on top of their wealth, so they can just go ahead and sign off billions and billions of dollars to be sent to countries they know very little about, or even relatively nothing about. And then there are those at the bottom of the totem pole, the food chain, that are busting their butts behind, day in and day out, okay? And their tax dollars are being embezzled by foreign corrupt government officials in Ukraine, okay? these officials are becoming instant millionaires. I mean, imagine that their own people are dying and they're profiting from all this stuff going on in their country, and they're embezzling funds that is supposed to go to, the population. Imagine that kind of mentality, folks.